Have you ever wondered what happens when the very best person in the world loses absolutely everything? This is the story of a man named Job. He was a man who had it all, a man God himself called good, until one day, in the blink of an eye, it was all taken away. In the quiet, sun-drenched land of Uzi, where the dust from the fields was the color of honey, lived Job. He was not just a good man, he was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His goodness was not a secret thing, hidden in his heart. It was as plain as the 7,000 sheep that dotted the hillsides like moving clouds, their wool thick and white. It was as real as the 3,000 camels that knelt patiently in the shade of his courtyards, their packs laden with spices and fine cloth from faraway lands. His wealth was a living, breathing thing. You could hear it in the lowing of 1,000 oxen as they pulled plows through his rich, dark soil. You could see it in the 500 donkeys that carried water and grain for his vast household. His home was not a house, but a small kingdom of peace and plenty. Servants bustled about, their faces content, for Job was a kind master. He knew their names, their families. He treated them with a respect that was rare in those days. But more precious to Job than any animal or field were his children. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and his heart swelled with love for them. They were grown now, with homes of their own, and they loved each other deeply. They would often hold feasts, taking turns hosting at each other's houses, their laughter echoing under the starry desert sky. Job, ever watchful, ever faithful, would rise early in the morning after these feasts. While the world was still washed in the soft, gray light of dawn, he would build an altar. He would carefully lay the stones, one by one, and there he would offer a sacrifice for each of his children. He would watch the smoke curl up towards the heavens and pray. Perhaps, he would think, perhaps my children have sinned in their hearts. Perhaps in their joy, they forgot God for a moment. He did this for them always. It was the rhythm of his love, the constant prayer of a father's heart. He was a man complete, blameless and upright, a man who honored God and turned away from evil. In all the land of Uzi, there was no one like him. His life was a beautiful, peaceful song. He could not have known that his song was being heard in a place far beyond the hills and the dust, in a place of unimaginable light and power. In the courts of heaven, where angels stand before the throne of God, a gathering was taking place. The sons of God, the heavenly beings, came to present themselves before the Lord. And among them came another figure. He was not there to worship. He was the challenger, the accuser, one whose purpose was to walk the earth, testing the hearts of men. The Lord's voice, like the sound of many waters, filled that holy place. "From where have you come?" The challenger answered, his voice cool and detached. From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it. He had seen everything. The kingdoms, the deserts, the struggles, the joys. Then the Lord spoke of Job. His voice was filled with a deep and holy pride. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." The challenger's response was like a sharp, cold stone dropped into a quiet pool. "Does Job fear God for nothing?" he asked. The question hung in the air, sharp and cynical. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land." He leaned in, his argument a subtle poison. "Of course he serves you. You've made him rich. You've made him safe. He has no reason not to." Then came the test, the terrible challenge. "But now, stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and I promise you, he will curse you to your face." The fate of the best man on earth hung in the balance. The question was a profound one. Can faith exist without reward? Can love for God be pure, even in the midst of pain? The Lord, knowing the heart of his servant Job, allowed the test. "Very well, then," the Lord said to the challenger. "Everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself, do not lay a finger." And with that permission, the challenger departed. A dark shadow was about to fall over the sun-drenched land of Uzi. Down on earth, Job knew nothing of this heavenly contest. He was simply living his day, overseeing his work, his heart at peace, completely unaware that his whole world was about to be torn apart. The day began like any other. The sun was high and hot. Job was likely in his main courtyard, perhaps discussing the price of wool with a merchant, or watching his son's children play in the dust. A cool breeze might have offered a moment of relief from the heat. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. Then, a man came running. He was one of Job's herdsmen, his face pale with terror, his clothes torn from running through thorns. He stumbled into the courtyard, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with horror. He fell before Job. "Master," he cried, his voice choked with panic. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaean raiders attacked. They swooped down from the hills like vultures. They carried off all the animals. He paused, swallowing hard, his next words barely a whisper. "And they put the servants to the sword. I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." Before Job could even stand up, before the shock could fully register on his face, another figure appeared at the edge of the courtyard. It was another servant, this one a shepherd. He was burned, his skin blistered, and he smelled of smoke and sulfur. He didn't even wait for the first messenger to finish. He spoke, his voice trembling. The fire of God fell from the sky. It burned up the sheep and the servants. It came from a clear blue sky, Master, a bolt of lightning that consumed everything. He collapsed, weeping. "I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." Job's mind was reeling. Raiders? Fire from heaven? It made no sense. This was not how the world worked. His world was one of order, of blessing, of peace. But there was no time to think. While the second man was still speaking, a third messenger arrived, a camel driver, his face a mask of disbelief. "Master, the Chaldeans. They formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on the camels. They have carried them all away." He pointed back the way he came, as if the raiders were still there. "They killed the servants. I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." In a matter of moments, Job's wealth, the work of a lifetime, was gone. The sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, all vanished. The foundation of his worldly existence had crumbled into dust. But the messengers had spoken of more than just animals. They spoke of servants, of men he knew, men with families. A wave of grief for them washed over him. But the final blow, the one that would shatter his heart into 1,000,000 pieces, was yet to come. While the third messenger was still catching his breath, a fourth man appeared. This was a servant from his eldest son's house. His face was not just filled with terror, it was a canvas of utter devastation. He looked at Job, and his eyes were hollow. He could barely speak. "Your sons and daughters, they were feasting. They were in the eldest brother's home." His voice broke. He took a deep, shuddering breath. Suddenly, a mighty wind swept in from the desert. It struck the 4 corners of the house. He looked down at the ground, unable to meet Job's eyes. The house, it collapsed on them. They're all gone. He finally looked up, tears streaming down his dust-caked face. "I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." Silence. The other messengers, their own news now seeming so small, faded into the background. The world stopped turning. The sun felt cold. The breeze died. All that was left was the sound of a father's world ending. His sons, his daughters, the joy of his heart, the lights of his life, extinguished. All of them, in one moment. Job stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were moving through deep water. The strength seemed to have gone from his legs. He looked at the sky, but there were no answers there. He looked at the faces of the terrified messengers. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had worked so hard to build a life for the children who were now gone. Then he did something that silenced everyone. He reached up and took the collar of his fine outer robe, and with a single, powerful motion, he tore it from top to bottom. It was a cry of grief that made no sound. Next, he took a razor, the kind used for shearing sheep, and he shaved his head, letting his hair fall into the dust. It was an act of total mourning, of stripping himself bare before his God. And then he fell to the ground. Not in a faint, not in a heap of despair, but he lowered himself, deliberately, onto his face in the dust. He was a king a moment ago, and now he was a beggar in the dirt. The messengers, the remaining servants, his wife who had surely heard the commotion, all watched in stunned silence. What would he do? What would he say? The challenger in heaven was watching, waiting for the curse. But the words that came from Job's lips were not a curse. They were a whisper of profound, heart-wrenching faith. "Naked I came from my mother's womb," he said to the dust, "and naked I will depart." He acknowledged the truth. "We come with nothing. We leave with nothing. The Lord gave," he whispered, remembering the faces of his children, the joy they brought him, "and the Lord has taken away." Then came the final, astonishing words, the words that shook the foundations of heaven and earth, the words that proved the challenger wrong. "May the name of the Lord be praised." In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. His heart was broken, but his faith was not. He had lost everything a man could lose, and yet he held on to the one thing that could not be taken. But the test was not over. The story of his suffering had only just begun. Back in the courts of heaven, the sons of God once again came to present themselves before the Lord. And again, the challenger was among them. The Lord's voice resounded, repeating his earlier praise, but this time with even greater weight. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And then, with a note of triumph, God added, and he still maintains his integrity, that you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. Job had held firm. The accuser's theory had been proven false. A man could love God for God's own sake, not just for the blessings. But the challenger was not finished. His cynicism ran deep. Skin for skin, he shot back. The phrase was an old proverb, meaning a person will give up anything they own to save themselves. A man will give all he has for his own life. The first test was too easy, he argued. You took his things. You took his children. But you haven't touched him. He issued a new, more terrible challenge. But now, stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. This time, the attack would be personal. It would be a trial of the body, a siege of constant, physical pain. Once again, the Lord allowed the test, for the question of faith's endurance had to be answered. But he set a clear and absolute boundary. Very well, then, the Lord said. He is in your hands. But you must spare his life. The challenger left the presence of the Lord, armed with a new and cruel permission. And on earth, Job, still grieving, still sitting in the ruins of his life, was about to face a new wave of agony. It began subtly. An itch. A small, sore spot on his arm. He might have ignored it at first, but then another appeared on his leg, and another on his back. Within hours, his entire body, from the soles of his feet to the crown of his shaved head, was covered in painful, inflamed sores. They were boils that burned like fire and itched with an intensity that was maddening. His skin, once healthy, became a landscape of pain. He could find no rest, no position that brought relief. Standing, sitting, lying down, every movement was torture. The sores wept and crusted over, making his clothes stick to him. The pain was relentless, a constant, nagging presence that gave him no peace, day or night. His life, which had once been lived in a beautiful home surrounded by family and servants, was now reduced to a miserable patch of ground outside the village. He took a piece of broken pottery, a potsherd, and moved to the town's ash heap. This was where people threw their refuse, their garbage, the remnants of fires. It was a place of filth and desolation. And there he sat, among the ashes, scraping his tormented skin with the sharp edge of the clay shard, trying in vain to find a moment's relief from the torment. He was unrecognizable. The greatest man in the East was now a wretched figure, shunned and isolated, his body a ruin, his home a pile of ashes. His own wife, who had suffered the loss of all her children alongside him, finally reached her breaking point. She looked at her husband, this man she had loved, now reduced to a moaning wreck, and her grief turned to bitter despair. She came to him as he sat in the filth, scraping himself. Her voice was sharp with her own agony. "Are you still maintaining your integrity?" she asked, her words dripping with scorn and sorrow. What was the point of being good if this was the result? Then she uttered the most terrible advice a wife could give her husband. Curse God and die. Just end it. Give up. It was a cry from the depths of her own shattered heart. Job looked up at her, his face a mask of pain, but his eyes were clear. He had lost his children, his wealth, his health. But he would not lose his reason. His voice was weak, but his words were strong. "You are talking like a foolish woman," he said, not with anger, but with a deep sadness. "Shall we accept good from God, and not trouble?" In that moment, Job defined the nature of true faith. It was not a contract where we only accept the good parts. It was a relationship, one that endured through sunshine and through the darkest storms. And even in this, covered in sores, sitting in ashes, Job did not sin in what he said. His ordeal, however, was becoming known. News of the catastrophe that had befallen the great man of Uz traveled on the dusty merchant roads. And in their own lands, 3 of Job's friends heard of his plight. There was Eliphaz from Teman, Bildad from Shua, and Zophar from Naamah. These were wise, important men, old friends who had shared meals and conversations with Job in his days of prosperity. When they heard of all the troubles that had come upon him, they made a plan. They would go together to sympathize with him and to comfort him. They set out from their homes, their hearts heavy, to find their friend. They thought they were going to offer solace. They had no idea they were about to make his suffering infinitely worse. The 3 friends traveled for days, their minds filled with concern for Job. They imagined finding him grieving, sad, perhaps impoverished. They prepared words of comfort, speeches of wisdom they could share to help him make sense of his tragedy. They were good men with good intentions, but they were walking into a situation far beyond their understanding. When they finally arrived at the edge of the town and saw the ash heap, they scanned the area for their friend. Then they saw him, a figure sitting in the dirt, covered in sores, scraping himself with a piece of pottery. His form was so twisted by pain, his appearance so ravaged by disease, that at first they did not recognize him. When the awful realization dawned that this broken creature was their friend, the great and noble Job, they were overcome. They cried out loud, their voices a mixture of shock and horror. They tore their own robes in a shared gesture of grief. They scooped up dust from the ground and threw it into the air over their heads, letting it settle on them like a shroud. Their prepared speeches died on their lips. What could they possibly say in the face of such absolute devastation? Words were useless. So they did the one truly comforting thing they would do for their friend. They simply sat down on the ground with him. They didn't speak a word. Not one. For 7 days and 7 nights, the 4 men sat in a profound, shared silence. The sun beat down on them by day, and the cold desert air chilled them by night. They sat amidst the stench of refuse and disease, a silent tableau of misery. They kept their vigil, because they saw that his suffering was very great. In those 7 silent days, Job was not alone. He had the company of friends who were, for that short time, sharing in his pain without judgment. But silence, like a dam, can only hold back the flood of words for so long. On the 7th day, the pressure of unspoken thoughts, of burning questions, of unbearable grief, became too much. It was Job who finally broke the silence. And the words that poured out of him were not words of faith and praise. They were a torrent of pure, undiluted anguish. He opened his mouth and he cursed the day he was born. "May the day of my birth perish," he cried, his voice raw and cracked from disuse. And the night that said, "A boy is conceived." He didn't curse God. He cursed his own existence. He wished he had never been born, that the day of his birth be wiped from the calendar, shrouded in the deepest darkness. "Why did I not die at birth?" he wailed, looking at his friends, his eyes pleading for an answer they could not give. "Why did I not perish as I came from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me and breasts that I might nurse?" He imagined the peace of the grave, a place where slaves are free from their masters and the weary are at rest. "Why is light given to those in misery?" he asked the empty air, "and life to those in anguish of soul?" It was the great, human cry against suffering. What is the point of life when it is nothing but pain? He confessed his deepest fears. "What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil." His lament hung in the hot, still air. It was a raw, honest, and desperate cry. His friends listened, their faces grim. The 7 days of silent compassion were over. The time for answers, they decided, had come. They believed they knew the reason for Job's suffering. And one by one, they would share their wisdom, a wisdom that would feel the Job like stones being thrown at a drowning man. Eliphaz the Temanite was the first to speak. He was the oldest, and likely the most respected of the 3. He started gently, almost apologetically. "If someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? But who can keep from speaking now?" He acknowledged Job's past. "Think how you have instructed many, how you have strengthened feeble hands." He was reminding Job of his own wisdom, but there was a subtle shift in his tone. He was moving from sympathy to theology. He was about to explain the rules of the universe as he saw them. "Consider now," Eliphaz said, his voice taking on a teacher's tone. "Who, being innocent, has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed?" The question was not really a question. It was an accusation, wrapped in a thin blanket of piety. The implication was clear. If you are suffering this much, you cannot be innocent. "As I have observed," he continued, speaking like a man who has it all figured out, "those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it." He was telling Job, his friend who was covered in sores and drowning in grief, that he was simply harvesting the results of his own secret sins. To make his point stronger, Eliphaz then told a chilling story. He spoke of a vision he had in the night, a terrifying, supernatural encounter. "A spirit glided past my face, and the hair on my body stood on end. It stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes, and I heard a voice, a whisper." The voice from his vision asked the question, can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker? The answer was, of course, no. Eliphaz's point was that all humans are flawed, and God is perfectly just. Therefore, Job's suffering must be a just punishment for some hidden flaw, some secret pride. He concluded with what he thought was helpful advice. If it were I would appeal to God, he said. I would lay my cause before him. He told Job to accept his punishment, to see it as discipline from the Almighty. Blessed is the one whom God corrects, so do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. He promised that if Job would just confess and repent, God would heal him and restore everything. Eliphaz sat back, satisfied. He had offered a logical, theological explanation for Job's pain. He believed he had helped. He had no idea how deeply his words had wounded his friend. Job listened to Eliphaz's speech, and every word felt like another lash on his already tormented body. This was not comfort. This was condemnation. He looked at his old friend, and a fresh wave of despair washed over him. He had hoped for a friend to mourn with him, and instead, he got a judge to lecture him. He lifted his weary head and spoke, his voice filled with a new kind of pain, the pain of being misunderstood. If only my anguish could be weighed, he began, and my misery laid with it on the scales. It would surely outweigh the sand of the seas. He was trying to make them understand the sheer, crushing weight of his suffering. It was not a small thing, not a simple discipline. His anger and frustration were directed at his so-called comforters. My friends, he said, his voice laced with bitter disappointment, have proved as unreliable as a seasonal brook, as streams that overflow when winter melts, but in the heat of summer, they vanish. When he needed them most, their comfort had dried up. He defended himself against Eliphaz's implied accusation. Teach me, and I will be quiet, he challenged them. Show me where I have been wrong. How painful are honest words. But what does your argument prove? He was begging them for real evidence, not just neat, tidy theories. He cried out again in his physical agony, describing the horrors of his nights. I lie down and think, how long before I get up? The night drags on, and I toss and turn until dawn. My body is clothed with worms and scabs, my skin is broken and festering. This was his reality. It was not a theological problem to be solved. It was a living hell to be endured. Then he turned his focus from his friends to God. His words became a direct, desperate plea to the one who seemed to be his silent adversary. Am I the sea, or the monster of the deep, that you put me under guard? He asked. He felt like a prisoner, haunted and targeted by God for reasons he could not fathom. He longed for death as a release. I despise my life. I would not live forever. Let me alone. My days have no meaning. His speech was a chaotic mixture of self-defense, disappointment in his friends, and a raw, painful appeal to God. He was not cursing God, but he was questioning him with a startling and honest boldness. He ended by looking straight at Eliphaz. If I have sinned, what have I done to you, you watcher of mankind? Why have you made me your target? Have I become a burden to you? He maintained his innocence, not of ever having a wrong thought, but of having committed some great, secret evil that would warrant this level of destruction. He slumped back into the ashes, exhausted by the effort. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was not a silence of shared grief, but a tense, heavy silence, filled with judgment and misunderstanding. The first round of comfort was over, and it had only dug Job's pit of despair even deeper. And another friend was ready to speak. Bildad the Shuhite was not as poetic as Eliphaz. He was a man of tradition, a man who believed in simple, cause-and-effect justice. He listened to Job's passionate outcry and was not moved to compassion. He was offended by it. He saw Job's words as an attack on the very character of God. He cleared his throat, his expression severe. How long will you say such things? He began, his voice sharp and scolding. Your words are nothing but a blustering wind. There was no gentleness in his approach. He went straight for the attack. Does God pervert justice? He demanded. Does the Almighty pervert what is right? To Bildad, the issue was black and white. God is good. God is just. Therefore, whatever happens must be good and just. There was no room for mystery, no space for a suffering that didn't make sense. Then, he delivered a line of such cruelty that it must have felt like a physical blow to Job. Speaking of Job's dead children, Bildad said, when your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. He was saying that Job's beloved sons and daughters got what they deserved. He used the death of Job's children as evidence for his theological argument. He saw the flicker of horror in Job's eyes, but he pressed on, convinced he was speaking the truth. But if you will seek God earnestly, he continued, laying out his simple formula, and plead with the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, even now he will rouse himself on your behalf and restore you to your prosperous state. Bildad's proof was not a mystical vision like Eliphaz. His proof was tradition. Ask the former generation, he instructed Job, and find out what their ancestors learned. He spoke of the wisdom of the ancients, the proverbs passed down through time. Can papyrus grow tall where there is no marsh? Can reeds thrive without water? His point was that, just as in nature, there are fixed laws. The wicked are like weeds that wither quickly, while the righteous flourish. Since Job was clearly withering, the conclusion was obvious to Bildad. You must be wicked. Surely God does not reject one who is blameless or strengthen the hands of evildoers, he declared with absolute certainty. He finished his speech with a neat and tidy promise. If Job would just admit his guilt, he will yet fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with shouts of joy. Bildad sat back, convinced he had defended God's honor and shown Job the clear path back to blessing. He had taken a complex, agonizing human tragedy and reduced it to a simple, brutal equation: sin equals suffering. Job heard Bildad's heartless words about his children, and any hope for understanding from his friends vanished. He was truly alone now, surrounded by accusers. He knew their theology. He had probably believed it himself, once, when the sun was shining on his life. But his own experience now proved that their simple formulas were wrong. Indeed, I know that this is true, Job responded, a weary sarcasm in his voice. But how can a mortal be righteous before God? He wasn't agreeing with Bildad's accusation. He was taking the argument to a different level. Of course, no one is perfect compared to God. But does any small imperfection deserve this? He described God's power in awesome, terrifying terms. A God so powerful he moves mountains, who shakes the earth from its place, who commands the sun not to shine. If he snatches away, who can stop him? Who can say to him, "What are you doing?" Job's problem was not that he didn't believe in God's power. His problem was that this immense, untamable power seemed to be aimed directly at him, for no reason. How then can I dispute with him? Job asked, his voice full of despair. Even if I were innocent, I could not answer him. I could only plead with my judge for mercy. He felt completely overwhelmed, like a tiny boat in a cosmic hurricane. Arguing with God was pointless. His sense of injustice grew. This is what was so maddening. It is all the same, he said, a shocking statement that directly contradicted his friend's beliefs. That is why I say, he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. This was the truth of his own life. He was blameless, yet he was being destroyed. The neat and tidy rules of his friends did not apply. He felt hunted. If I am guilty, woe to me. Even if I am innocent, I cannot lift my head, for I am full of shame and drowned in my affliction. There was no way out. If he was guilty, he deserved it. If he was innocent, it was happening anyway, which was a kind of madness he couldn't comprehend. He cried out to God again, his words a painful mixture of awe and accusation. Your hand shaped me and made me, he said, remembering that he was God's creation. Will you now turn and destroy me? Remember that you molded me like clay. Will you now turn me to dust again? The speech ended with another plea for relief, for just a moment of peace before he died. Let me alone, that I may have a moment's joy before I go to the place of no return, to the land of gloom and utter darkness. He was exhausted, not just from his physical pain, but from the mental and spiritual battle of trying to defend his integrity to friends who refused to listen. One friend remained to speak, Zophar the Naamathite. And if Job thought Eliphaz was condescending and Bildad was cruel, he was about to experience a new level of harshness. Zophar was a dogmatic man, blunt and self-righteous, and he was bursting with indignation at Job's words. Zophar didn't even pretend to be gentle. He jumped into this speech with undisguised contempt. Are all these words to go unanswered? Is this talker to be vindicated? He mocked Job. Will no one rebuke you when you mock? To Zophar, Job's claims of innocence were not just wrong, they were an insult to God. You say to God, my beliefs are flawless and I am pure in your sight. Oh, how I wish that God would speak, that he would open his lips against you. Zophar was so certain he was right that he was actually wishing for God to appear and prove him so. He then accused Job of foolishness. Can you fathom the mysteries of God? Can you probe the limits of the Almighty? They are higher than the heavens. What can you do? They are deeper than the depths of the grave. What can you know? Zophar used the greatness of God not to inspire awe, as Job had, but as a weapon to beat Job into submission. The message was, you are too small and stupid to understand, so just shut up and accept your punishment. Then came Zophar's most arrogant and hurtful claim. Know this, he said, leaning forward as if sharing a great secret. God has even forgotten some of your sin. He was telling Job that his suffering, as terrible as it was actually less than what he truly deserved. It was an act of breathtaking cruelty, presented as divine wisdom. Like the others, Zophar offered a path to restoration based on a full confession. If you devote your heart to him and stretch out your hands to him, if you put away the sin that is in your hand, then you will lift up your face without shame. He painted a beautiful picture of a future life for Job, free from fear and full of light. But it was all conditional on Job admitting to the secret wickedness that Zophar was convinced he was hiding. He concluded his speech with a final, grim warning. But the eyes of the wicked will fail, and escape will elude them. Their hope will become a dying gasp. The message was clear: confess, or this is your end. Zophar fell silent. The three friends had now all spoken. They had presented their case, a united front of theological certainty. They had analyzed, accused, and advised. And in doing so, they had built a wall of words around Job, isolating him completely in his agony. They waited for their friend to finally break, to confess, to accept their wisdom. They were not prepared for his response. Job had endured the pain of his body. He had endured the loss of everything he held dear. Now he was enduring the assault of his friend's toxic counsel. And something inside him snapped. The weariness and grief in his voice were now joined by a surge of powerful, righteous anger and brilliant sarcasm. He looked at the three of them, these self-appointed experts on God. "Doubtless you are the people," he began, his voice dripping with irony, "and wisdom will die with you." It was a stunning opening. He was mocking their arrogance, their belief that they had a monopoly on truth. "But I have a mind as well as you," he declared, his strength seeming to return. "I am not inferior to you. Who does not know all these things?" He dismissed their proverbs and traditional wisdom as common knowledge, things any child would know. He was not impressed by their simple platitudes. He then turned their own words back on them, pointing out the bitter irony of his situation. "I, who called on God and got an answer, have become a laughingstock to my friends. I, the man who was righteous and blameless, am a laughingstock." He felt the sting of their betrayal most keenly. He spoke of the reality he saw around him, a reality that flew in the face of their neat theories. "The tents of marauders are undisturbed," he observed, "and those who provoke God are secure, those who carry their God in their hands." He saw wicked people prospering all the time. Their rulebook for the universe was clearly full of holes. "But ask the animals, and they will teach you," he continued, his voice rising, "or the birds in the sky, and they will tell you, or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish in the sea inform you." He was saying that all of creation knows one thing for certain, that everything is in the hand of the Lord. But knowing God is in control did not answer the question of why this was happening. He then turned his attention back to his friends, and his tone became sharp, dismissive. He was a patient no longer. He was a debater, ready to dismantle their arguments. "Your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay," he told them. Their wisdom was worthless, fragile, and dirty. "Keep silent and let me speak," he commanded them, taking control of the conversation. "Then let come to me what may." He was done trying to get them to understand. He was ready now to make his case directly to God, and he didn't care what the consequences were. In a moment of incredible, desperate faith, he made a declaration that has echoed through the centuries. "Though he slay me," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination, "yet will I hope in him." It was the ultimate statement of trust, not in a safe God, but in a God he could not understand, a God who felt like his killer. And in the same breath, he added, "I will surely defend my ways to his face." He would trust God, but he would not lie about his own integrity to do it. He pleaded with God for just two things. "Only grant me two things, God, and then I will not hide from you. Withdraw your hand far from me, and stop making me afraid of your terrors." He just wanted the assault to stop long enough for him to plead his case, to have his day in court. He then laid out his challenge, his legal summons to the Almighty. "Then summon me, and I will answer, or let me speak, and you reply to me. How many wrongs and sins have I committed? Show me my offense and my sin. Why do you hide your face and consider me your enemy?" He had moved beyond lament. He was now demanding answers. He was a man on trial who believed in his own innocence, and he was calling the judge to the witness stand. The friends sat in stunned silence. This was not the broken, repentant man they were hoping to create. This was a man of terrifying, unshakable conviction. The debate had just entered a new and much more intense phase. The friends were shocked into silence by Job's powerful and defiant speech. But it was Eliphaz, the first to speak, who recovered first. He had tried the gentle approach, the mystical approach. Now, seeing Job so unrepentant, his tone hardened. The second cycle of speeches was about to begin, and the gloves were coming off. Would a wise person answer with empty notions or fill their belly with the hot east wind? Eliphaz began, his voice dripping with scorn. He was no longer treating Job as a suffering friend, but as a foolish adversary. You are undermining piety and hindering devotion to God. Your sin prompts your mouth. You adopt the tongue of the crafty. Eliphaz was now directly accusing Job of being a sinner whose own words condemned him. He twisted Job's honest cries of pain into evidence of wickedness. He saw Job's defense of his own integrity not as honesty, but as monumental pride. He mocked Job's desire for understanding. Are you the first man ever born? Were you brought forth before the hills? Do you listen in on God's counsel? Do you have a monopoly on wisdom? The sarcasm was thick. He was belittling Job, trying to cut him down to size. He fell back on his old argument, but with more force. The wisdom of the elders, the tradition of the fathers, was on his side. He then painted a dark and vivid picture of the life of a wicked man. He didn't say Job's name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. The wicked man writhes in pain all his days, Eliphaz said, his eyes fixed on Job. Terrifying sounds fill his ears. When all seems well, marauders attack him. He described a man who lives in constant fear, who never finds peace, whose wealth is fleeting, and who ultimately comes to ruin. Every detail was chosen to mirror Job's own calamity. He was essentially narrating Job's life story and labeling it the fate of the wicked. He concluded that this was the lot God allots to the wicked, the heritage God appoints for them. There was no comfort here, no sympathy. It was a brutal, direct confirmation of his initial theory. You are suffering because you are evil. Your pain is proof of your sin. Job listened, and the space between him and his friends grew into a vast, unbridgeable chasm. They were not on the same planet anymore. They were speaking different languages. They looked at his suffering and saw the justice of God. He looked at his suffering and saw a terrible, inexplicable mystery. I have heard many things like these, Job replied, his voice flat with exhaustion. You are miserable comforters, all of you. Will your long-winded speeches never end? He was tired of their words, tired of their useless wisdom. I also could speak like you, he said, a flash of his old fire returning. If you were in my place, I could heap up words against you and shake my head at you. He imagined being in their position, healthy and comfortable, and he knew how easy it was to spout off theories when you aren't the one in pain. But, he added, my mouth would encourage you. Comfort from my lips would bring you relief. He was pointing out that they had failed the most basic test of friendship. His attention shifted again, away from these men and back to the ultimate source of his trouble, God. His language became even more stark, more violent. God has turned me over to the ungodly, he cried. He has torn me in his anger and attacked me. He gnashes his teeth at me. My enemy pierces me with his eyes. He felt like he was being physically assaulted by God himself. He described his utter degradation. Men open their mouths to jeer at me. They strike my cheek in scorn and unite together against me. His friends were part of this assault. He was a public spectacle of misery. Yet, even in this pit of despair, a flicker of an impossible hope appeared. It was a new thought, a stunning idea that seemed to come out of nowhere. He looked past his friends, past his pain, and looked toward heaven. Even now my witness is in heaven, he declared, his voice gaining a strange new confidence. My advocate is on high. My intercessor is my friend as my eyes pour out tears to God. He was beginning to believe that there was someone in heaven who was on his side, someone who could plead his case for him before the angry judge. It was a confusing thought. How could God be both his attacker and his advocate? But in the depths of his pain, he was reaching for a more complex view of God than his friends could ever imagine. He ended with a cry of his own mortality. My spirit is broken. My days are cut short. The grave awaits me. The flicker of hope was there, but it was still surrounded by the deepest darkness. He was a man torn between the God who was destroying him and the God he hoped would save him. Bildad was next, and he was even more incensed than before. Job's talk of a witness in heaven was, to him, just more arrogant nonsense. He was frustrated that Job was not listening to their superior logic. When will you end these speeches? Bildad snapped, his patience completely gone. Be sensible, and then we can talk. Why are we regarded as cattle, esteemed as stupid in your eyes? He was offended that Job had dismissed their wisdom. He felt personally insulted. His argument this time was a variation on the same theme, but darker, more graphic. He described the trap that awaits the wicked. The wicked man is thrown into a net. He walks into a pitfall. A trap seizes him by the heel. A snare holds him fast. Bildad's description of the fate of the wicked was a horror story. His roots dry up below and his branches wither above. The memory of him perishes from the earth. He has no name in the land. He is driven from light into darkness and is banished from the world. He has no offspring or descendants among his people. Every word was a poisoned arrow aimed straight at Job. Job had lost his children. He was losing his place in the world. Bildad was telling him that this was the inevitable end for a man like him, a man who does not know God. He was condemning Job not just to suffering in this life, but to utter oblivion after death. His final line was delivered with a cold, final certainty. Surely such is the dwelling of an evil man. Such is the place of one who does not know God. He sat down, having painted a picture of Job's complete and utter annihilation. He was trying to scare Job into repentance. Job looked at the hard, unforgiving face of Bildad, and his heart sank even lower. How could these men, who once shared bread with him, be so cruel? How long will you torment me and crush me with words? He cried out, his voice breaking. 10 times now you have reproached me. Shamelessly you attack me. He was keeping score. He felt every verbal blow. You say my error is my own, he continued. But even if I have erred, it is my own affair. He then made his case crystal clear, something his friends seemed incapable of understanding. I want you to know that it is God who has wronged me and drawn his net around me. He was not blaming fate, or raiders, or the weather. He was placing the responsibility squarely on God. This was a theological crisis of the highest order. Though I cry, violence, I get no response, he lamented. Though I call for help, there is no justice. He described how God had walled up his path, stripped him of his honor, and uprooted his hope like a tree. He then described his profound isolation, a pain perhaps even deeper than his physical source. He has alienated my family from me. My acquaintances are completely estranged from me. My relatives have gone away. My closest friends have forgotten me. He spoke of how his servants ignored him, how even small children scorned him. The social fabric of his life had been completely shredded. Then came his most famous and pitiful plea, a cry that has resonated with suffering people for thousands of years. He looked at the 3 stony faces of his friends, and with all the energy he had left, he begged them, "Have pity on me, my friends, have pity, for the hand of God has struck me." He was not asking for answers anymore. He was just begging for a little bit of human compassion. But then, his mood shifted again. As if realizing that pity from these men was impossible, he reached for something more permanent. He wished his words could be recorded forever. Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead, or engraved in rock forever. He wanted his testimony, his claim of innocence, to outlive him. And in that moment of wanting to preserve his story, his faith took another astonishing leap forward. It was the climax of his struggle, the highest peak of hope he had reached so far. I know that my Redeemer lives, he declared, his voice ringing with a sudden, unshakable conviction, and that in the end, he will stand on the earth. This Redeemer, this Goel, in Hebrew, was a kinsman redeemer, a relative who had the duty to rescue, vindicate, and avenge a family member who had been wronged. Job was claiming a heavenly relative who would ultimately stand up for him. And after my skin has been destroyed, he continued, looking down at his own ravaged body, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I, and not another. How my heart yearns within me. It was an incredible statement. He believed that even after death, he would be vindicated. He would have his day in court, and he would see God, not as an enemy, but as his champion. He had found a hope that was bigger than his suffering, bigger than death itself. It was a hope that his friends, with their neat and tidy system of rewards and punishments, could never have imagined. After this profound declaration, he collapsed back, utterly spent, his heart pounding with the force of this revelation. Zophar was the last to speak in the second round, and he was completely unmoved by Job's breathtaking declaration of faith. He only heard the parts that sounded like a challenge to his own worldview. He was, as he said, greatly disturbed. My troubled thoughts prompt me to answer, Zophar began, as if his own internal agitation was proof of his righteousness. He was insulted by what he called Job's shameful rebuke. He didn't offer any new arguments. He simply doubled down on his old one, describing the fate of the wicked in even more gruesome detail. Surely you know how it has been from of old, he said condescendingly, that the mirth of the wicked is brief, the joy of the godless lasts but a moment. He described a wicked man whose wealth is a poison that he will be forced to vomit up. He will not enjoy the streams, the rivers flowing with honey and cream. What he toiled for he must give back. He will not enjoy the profit from his trading. Zophar's speech was filled with images of physical torment and divine retribution. God will unleash his fierce anger against him and rain down his blows on him. Though he flees from an iron weapon, a bronze-tipped arrow pierces him. The message was relentless. This is you, Job. This is your fate because you are a secret sinner. He concluded with absolute finality. Total darkness is reserved for his treasures. A fire not fanned by human hands will consume him. The heavens will expose his guilt. The earth will rise up against him. This is the wicked man's lot from God, the heritage decreed for him. With that, the second cycle of speeches was complete. The friends had hammered Job with their accusations, their threats, and their cold, unfeeling theology. They had done their best to break his spirit and force a confession. But Job was still standing, metaphorically at least. He was bruised, battered, and heartbroken, but he was not broken. He was still clinging to his integrity and to the strange, new, and difficult hope that his Redeemer lived. The stage was set for the final round of this painful debate. Job was weary. The endless cycle of accusation and defense had worn him down. He looked at his three friends, their faces set like stone, and he knew that nothing he could say would change their minds. Yet, he had to answer. He had to speak the truth as he saw it, even if no one would listen. Listen carefully to my words, he pleaded one last time. Let that be the comfort you give me. Bear with me while I speak, and then after I have spoken, you can go on mocking. He tried again to explain that his complaint was not with them, but with God. Is my complaint directed to a human being? Why should I not be impatient? He was wrestling with the Almighty, a struggle they couldn't begin to comprehend. He described the prosperity of the wicked again, challenging their core belief system. Why do the wicked live on, growing old and increasing in power? They see their children established around them. Their homes are safe and free from fear. The rod of God is not on them. This was the world he saw, and it did not fit their rules. The wicked sing and dance and spend their years in prosperity and then die peacefully. He directly attacked their simplistic argument that the children of the wicked are punished. You say, God stores up the punishment of the wicked for their children. Let him repay the wicked themselves, so that they will know it. Let their own eyes see their destruction. Job's sense of justice demanded that people be held accountable for their own actions, not for the actions of their parents. He dismissed their arguments as hollow. So how can you console me with your nonsense? Nothing is left of your answers but falsehood. He had heard enough. Their wisdom was bankrupt. From this point on, the debate began to break down. The third cycle of speeches is shorter in the biblical text, as if the friends are starting to run out of arguments. Eliphaz spoke one last time, his words weary but still biting. He repeated his old claim that a human can be of no benefit to God, and that Job's righteousness or wickedness doesn't affect the Almighty. He then launched into his most specific and baseless accusations yet. He was no longer hinting at secret sins. He was inventing them. Is not your wickedness great? Are not your sins endless? He asked. You demanded security from your relatives for no reason. You stripped the naked of their clothing. You gave no water to the weary, and you withheld food from the hungry. He painted Job as a cruel oppressor, a man who abused the poor, the widow, and the orphan. These were terrible, slanderous lies, the exact opposite of the man Job truly was. Eliphaz was so committed to his theory that he had to invent sins for Job to have committed. His advice was the same as always. Submit to God and be at peace with him. In this way, prosperity will come to you. It was the same broken record of conditional blessing. Job's response to this final, vicious attack was not to engage with the specific lies. It was pointless. Instead, his focus went entirely to his one, consuming desire, to find God and plead his case. Even today my complaint is bitter, he said. His hand is heavy in spite of my groaning. If only I knew where to find him. If only I could go to his dwelling. I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would find out what he would answer me and consider what he would say. He felt lost, searching for a God who was hiding from him. But if I go to the east, he is not there. If I go to the west, I do not find him. When he is at work in the north, I do not see him. When he turns to the south, I catch no glimpse of him. God was everywhere, yet for Job, he was nowhere to be found. And then, in the midst of this feeling of abandonment, came another profound statement of faith, a quiet anchor in the storm of his emotions. But he knows the way that I take, Job said with a calm certainty. When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. He knew he was in a fiery trial, a refiner's fire. And he had faith that the process, as painful as it was not for destruction, but for purification. He believed that on the other side of this, his true character, like pure gold, would be revealed. After this, Bildad spoke one last, short, and faltering speech. He was out of ideas. He simply repeated the old theme of God's majesty and man's insignificance. How then can a mortal be righteous before God? How can one born of woman be pure? If even the moon is not bright and the stars are not pure in his eyes, how much less a mortal, who is but a maggot, a son of man, who is only a worm? It was his final, pathetic attempt to silence Job. Zophar, it seems, had nothing left to say at all. He remained silent. Job had won the debate. His friends were silenced, their arguments exhausted. Now, Job delivered his final, magnificent monologue. He was no longer speaking to them, but to the heavens, to the world, to history. He was making his closing statement. He began with soaring sarcasm, a final dismissal of his friends' help. How you have helped the powerless. How you have saved the arm that is feeble. What advice you have offered to one without wisdom. Then, for a long time, he spoke. He began by reminiscing about his past, the months gone by when God's intimate friendship blessed my house. He painted a beautiful, nostalgic picture of his former life. A life where he was respected by all, from the oldest to the youngest. The young men saw me and stepped aside, and the old men rose to their feet, he recalled. The chief men refrained from speaking and covered their mouths with their hands. He was a champion of the poor and the needy. I rescued the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to assist them. The one who was dying blessed me. I made the widow's heart sing. This was the man he was, and this was the man Eliphaz had slandered. Then he contrasted that bright past with his dark present. But now, he said, his voice dropping, men younger than I mock me, men whose fathers I would have disdained to put with my sheepdogs. He was an outcast, spat on, reviled. He described his physical suffering again, the relentless pain, the dark, sleepless nights. Finally, he made his ultimate appeal. He swore a great oath of innocence, a formal, legal declaration before God. He went through a long list of potential sins and swore he was innocent of every one. I have made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a young woman, he began. He declared his innocence from falsehood, from adultery, from mistreating his servants, from ignoring the poor, from trusting in his wealth, from worshiping idols, from rejoicing in his enemy's misfortune. It was a comprehensive and powerful declaration of a life lived with integrity. He was placing himself, his entire life, before God for inspection. He ended with a final, dramatic challenge. Oh, that I had someone to hear me. I cite now my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. Surely I would wear it on my shoulder. I would put it on like a crown. I would give him an account of my every step. I would present it to him as to a prince. He was not afraid of the charges. He wanted to see them, to answer them. He was so confident in his integrity that he would wear the accusation like a crown. With that, Job rested his case. He had said all he could say. He fell silent, waiting for the verdict. The three friends had nothing more to say. The air was thick with unresolved tension. The great debate was over, and a new voice was about to be heard. For all this time, a fourth man had been present, sitting on the sidelines, listening to the entire exchange. His name was Elihu. He was much younger than Job and his three friends, and out of respect for his elders, he had kept silent. But now, he could hold back no longer. He was angry. He was angry with Job because Job justified himself rather than God. And he was angry with the three friends because they had found no way to refute Job, and yet had condemned him. They had failed, in his eyes, on every level. Elihu's presence was a surprise. He had not been mentioned before. He was a new character entering the stage for the final act. His energy was different. He was not weary like the others. He was young, passionate, and filled with a burning need to speak what he believed was the truth. I am young in years, and you are old, he began, addressing all four men. That is why I was fearful and hesitant to tell you what I know. I thought, age should speak, advanced years should teach wisdom. But, he said, he had listened, and he had heard nothing but folly. But it is the Spirit in a person, the breath of the Almighty, that gives them understanding. It is not only the old who are wise. He declared that he would not show partiality or flatter anyone. He was going to speak his mind, plainly and directly. And his argument was different from what had come before. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar had all operated on one simple principle: suffering is punishment for sin. Job had argued that this was not true in his case. Elihu offered a third perspective. He argued that suffering is not always punitive. Sometimes it is corrective. It is one of the ways God speaks to people, to get their attention, to save them from their own pride and folly. God does speak, Elihu insisted, now one way, now another, though no one perceives it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, he may speak in their ears and terrify them with warnings, to turn them from wrongdoing and keep them from pride. And if dreams and visions don't work, Elihu argued, then God uses pain. Or a person is chastened on a bed of pain, with constant strife in their bones. This suffering, he claimed, was not meant to destroy, but to rescue. It was a severe mercy, designed to bring a person to a point of humility and repentance, so that God could restore them. God does all these things to a person, twice, even 3 times, to turn them back from the pit, that the light of life may shine on them. Elihu affirmed God's justice, but he defined it differently. God is just, but his justice is intertwined with his mercy. He is not just a scorekeeper, tallying up sins and punishments. He is an active, engaged God who uses even pain to draw people closer to himself. He also took issue with Job's self-righteousness. While he agreed that the friends were wrong to accuse Job of specific, terrible sins, he felt that Job, in his passionate self-defense, had come dangerously close to accusing God of being unjust. You say, I am innocent, but God has deprived me of my rights, Elihu quoted Job. You say, what profit is it to me, and what do I gain by not sinning? Elihu saw this as pride. Job was so focused on his own integrity that he couldn't see the bigger picture. He was demanding that God operate according to his human sense of fairness. Far be it from God to do evil, from the Almighty to do wrong, Elihu declared. It is unthinkable that God would be unjust. He spoke for a long time, his words a torrent of youthful passion. He was trying to bridge the gap, to offer a more nuanced understanding of God's ways. He was not entirely right. He was still a human trying to explain the unexplainable, but he shifted the conversation. He moved it away from the sterile, legalistic debate about sin and punishment and toward a more relational understanding of God's interaction with humanity. As Elihu spoke, the atmosphere began to change. He spoke of God's majesty, not just in terms of raw power, but in his creation. He pointed to the clouds, the rain, the lightning, the snow. Listen to this, Job. Stop and consider God's wonders. And as he spoke of the storm, a real storm began to gather. The sky, which had been clear and hot, began to darken. The wind began to pick up, whipping dust and sand into the air. The temperature dropped. A deep, distant rumble of thunder echoed across the land. Elihu's speech reached its climax as the storm grew in intensity. He says to the snow, fall on the earth, and to the rain shower, be a mighty downpour. The breath of God produces ice, and the broad waters become frozen. He loads the clouds with moisture. He scatters his lightning through them. He looked at Job, his eyes wide with awe as the storm built around them. Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Tell us what we should say to him. We cannot state our case because of our darkness. His final words were almost lost in the rising gale. The Almighty is beyond our reach and exalted in power. In his justice and great righteousness, he does not oppress. Therefore, people revere him. Elihu fell silent. And into that silence, as the wind howled and the sky turned black, a new voice spoke. It was not the voice of a man. It was a voice that seemed to come from the very heart of the storm, from the center of the roaring whirlwind. It was the voice of the Lord. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? The voice thundered, a question directed at Job. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. This was the moment Job had longed for, his chance to face God. But it was not happening as he had imagined. He was not in a courtroom where he could state his case. He was being confronted by the raw, untamable power of the creator of the universe. God was not there to be cross-examined. God was there to do the questioning. And the questions began. They were not questions about Job's suffering or his sins. They were questions about the creation of the world. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me, if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Question after question came, a torrent of cosmic poetry. God spoke of the sea, how he shut it in behind doors and said, this far you may come and no farther. Here is where your proud waves halt. He asked Job if he had ever commanded the morning or walked in the recesses of the deep. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow or seen the storehouses of the hail? The voice from the whirlwind continued. What is the way to the place where the lightning is dispersed, or the place where the east winds are scattered over the earth? God was not explaining his reasons. He was expanding Job's perspective. He was taking Job on a verbal tour of the cosmos, showing him a universe so vast, so complex, so intricately designed, that Job's personal tragedy, as immense as it was only one small part of a much larger, mysterious tapestry. God spoke of the wild animals, creatures that lived outside the control of humanity. He asked Job about the mountain goats, the wild donkey set free, the powerful wild ox that cannot be tamed for farm work. He spoke of the ostrich, who seems foolish but can outrun a horse. He spoke of the hawk soaring on the wind and the eagle that nests on the highest crag. All these creatures existed for their own purpose, part of God's wild and beautiful world. They were not created for man's benefit. They were simply part of God's grand, creative plan. The implication was clear. Job, you are a part of my world, but you are not the center of it. You cannot possibly understand all my purposes. The voice from the whirlwind fell silent for a moment, waiting for a response. Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him. Job, who had once been so full of arguments, so ready to state his case, was utterly humbled. He was overwhelmed not by power, but by a sense of magnificent, beautiful, and terrifying mystery. He covered his mouth with his hand. I am unworthy, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. But God was not finished. The lesson was not yet complete. Brace yourself like a man, the voice commanded again. I will question you, and you shall answer me. The second speech began, and this time it was even more pointed. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? God challenged him directly. This was the pride Elihu had seen, the tendency to make God seem wrong in order to make oneself seem right. God then described two magnificent, powerful creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. He described Behemoth, a great land animal, perhaps like a hippopotamus, of immense strength. His strength is in his loins, his power in the muscles of his belly. His tail sways like a cedar. He is the first of the works of God. Then he described Leviathan, a fearsome sea creature, a crocodile or a mythical dragon, covered in impenetrable scales. Can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook or tie down its tongue with a rope? Anyone who lays a hand on it will remember the struggle and never do it again. It makes the depths churn like a boiling cauldron. Nothing on earth is its equal, a creature without fear. It looks down on all that are haughty. It is king over all that are proud. The point of describing these untamable beasts was profound. If you, Job, a mere man, cannot understand or control even these creatures that I have made, how can you possibly presume to understand or judge me, their creator? How can you think that the universe should run according to your limited human logic? The storm began to subside. The voice from the whirlwind had said its piece. It had not answered Job's why. It had not explained the reason for his suffering. Instead, it had given him something far more important. A direct, personal encounter with the wild, wise, and sovereign God who was in control of it all. And for Job, that was enough. It was more than enough. The need for an explanation vanished in the presence of the explainer. He looked up into the clearing sky, and he finally understood. He spoke one last time, no longer in protest or defense, but in humble surrender and worship. I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted, he began. He quoted God's own question back to him. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, Job confessed, things too wonderful for me to know. And then came his final, beautiful realization. My ears had heard of you, he said, thinking of the life he had lived before, a life of correct belief and faithful practice. But now my eyes have seen you. The experience had transformed him. His faith was no longer based on tradition or hearsay. It was now based on a direct, personal encounter with the living God. And because of that, he could say, therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. This was not a confession to the secret sins his friends had accused him of. It was a repentance for his pride, for his demand to understand, for his attempt to put God in a box of human logic. He was letting go of his need for answers and was resting in the presence and wisdom of God himself. The trial was over. Job had been tested to the absolute limit, and he had emerged not with answers, but with a deeper, more profound relationship with his Creator. After the whirlwind, A stillness settled over the land. Job sat in the ashes, but he was a changed man. His heart, once filled with turmoil, was now quiet. He had seen God, and that was all that mattered. Then the Lord spoke again, but this time he did not address Job. He turned his attention to Eliphaz the Temanite, who sat with his two friends in stunned, fearful silence. "I am angry with you and your two friends," the Lord's voice declared, and the words must have sent a chill of terror through them. "Because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." This was the final, stunning vindication of Job. The three friends, with all their correct-sounding theology and pious speeches, had been wrong. And Job, with all his messy, angry, desperate, and honest cries from the heart, had spoken what was true. He had wrestled with God honestly, while his friends had defended a lifeless caricature of him. The Lord then gave them a command. "So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly." The humiliation for these proud men was complete. They, the wise ones, had to be saved from God's anger by the prayers of the very man they had condemned as a great sinner. They had to go to him, with sacrifices in hand, and ask for his help. And so they did. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar did exactly as the Lord commanded them. They brought their animals to Job, their heads bowed in shame. And Job, a man who would have been justified in holding a bitter grudge, a man who had been tormented by their words, looked at his friends and he prayed for them. In that moment of forgiveness, Job's own restoration began. The Lord accepted Job's prayer. After this, the story of Job turns from loss to restoration, from sorrow to joy. The Lord began to bless the latter part of Job's life even more than the first. The healing started with his community. When his relatives and all his old acquaintances heard about everything that had happened to him, they came to see him. They ate with him in his house, and they comforted and consoled him over all the trouble the Lord had brought on him. Each one of them gave him a piece of silver and a gold ring. He was no longer an outcast. He was welcomed back into the fold of his people. His wealth was also restored, in a way that showed the abundant generosity of God. The Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Where he once had 7,000 sheep, he now had 14,000. Where he had 3,000 camels, he now had 6,000. His 1,000 oxen and 500 donkeys were doubled to 2,000 oxen and 1,000 donkeys. The land of Uz once again saw the prosperity of the house of Job, but now it was on a scale grander than ever before. But the greatest blessing, the one that healed the deepest wound in his heart, was the restoration of his family. He had 10 more children, 7 sons and 3 new daughters. And the story tells us something special about these daughters. Nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters, we are told. And their father gave them an inheritance along with their brothers, a remarkable act of love and respect in that ancient culture. He named them Jemima, Keziah, and Karen-Happuch, names that meant dove, cinnamon, and horn of eye makeup, names of beauty and delight.